I know we didn't want to do a session tonight about COVID, but the question has come up, and it really resonated with me about the watering can, actually, just thinking about the fact that we all really need to think about our mental well-being at the moment.
100%.
We know death and dying is very different at the moment. More people are aware of death and dying. People are often dying unexpectedly. The way that we support people when they're dying, whether we're allowed to visit as often, and the way that we grieve through and our friends are so different. What advice can we give people on how to cope with that? Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think we are going through unprecedented times at the moment, and we're going through a global pandemic. So it's affecting every single person on the planet, everybody. There's not one person that isn't being affected by this. I've been developing this, the watering you concept for a very long time, and I think it is really important, actually, to really take a step back and think about, when people have said to me, Julie, how on earth have you got through the things that have happened to you on your journey? And the reason is because I walk my talk. I put into practice what I myself, so just an example today, I knew that I would be working, tonight, I'll be talking tonight. I was working this afternoon. I had a meeting I had to attend. So this morning, I did some Pilates. I stayed in bed a bit longer, cuddled my dog, just had a bit of breakfast, and just didn't overdo it, because I knew that I had to, I wanted to be on top form this evening, and I wanted to be on top form with my meeting. So I think, it's the same for everybody. Nobody can be excluded here. We all have a mental health, we all have a physical health, we all have an emotional health. But if we don't take care of that, if we don't know what we need, to top ourselves up, we can't give out. And that goes for, particularly for people like us who give a lot to others. We have a tendency to not think about ourselves. So it's taken me a very, very long time to get to this point. But I think, when you're ill, when you're, COVID is just, it's causing so many awful problems for people. And yeah, but it still comes back to, you still need to take good care of yourself, to be able to care for others, and, to get through illness, and, what have you. Sorry, Kathryn.
Yeah, I think we've got a lovely mixture in this call tonight of people who are healthcare professionals and people who are, well, all of us, people who might someday need to use the care of healthcare professionals. During COVID, I went back to work for a while. Recently retired doctors were put back onto the GMC register. And I went back to my old hospital where they wouldn't let me see patients. And I felt very conflicted about that, I have to say. But they did want me to do some work for staff support. And that was absolutely fascinating, because I had assumed that the biggest stress would be how busy it was, how frightening it was. And to start off with, it certainly was. I spoke to people who really honestly thought that coming to work would kill them, but they still came to work. But gradually, as people at work weren't getting sick and they started to realize that the PPE was adequate, even though they felt very vulnerable in it, what the message that I got from almost everywhere that I went was people not being with their beloveds while they were dying was the most difficult thing, and a sense of overwhelming sadness from staff. And these stories of student nurses, medical students, healthcare assistants, senior doctors whose wards had been closed coming to work as junior doctors in the COVID wards, sitting, holding hands, making phone calls to families to convey the tender conversations that usually are the bedside conversations between the person in the bed and their immediate family. Staff have been having to offer the relay of conveying those messages in both directions, and how heartbreaking the intimacy of that was. So I think the first message I really heard was how hard people were working so that people who were sick enough to die, some of whom did die and some of whom got better, but once somebody was believed to be so sick they might die, to have them almost never on their own, if that could possibly be delivered. And I think that's a really fantastic thing to have happened. The other thing I think is really important, and I think it's come out from the kind of pass the parcel that Julie and I have been discussing this evening, is people in bereavement make sense of what has happened by turning it into the story of what happened as their beloved person was dying. And if people can't be there, how do they know what the story was? And so part of what's been really important to staff has been to give families the story, not just the kind of hospital platitudes that you normally get on the phone, but actually he had a cup of tea at X o'clock and then he settled down and he hasn't actually been awake since then. Because those are the sorts of information that families relay to each other as people come in and take over around the deathbed, aren't they? And then gradually families were allowed to have one or possibly two visitors if somebody was so sick that they might die. And they then have been able to collect the story for the rest of the family. But you then realize that's really hard. Normally, I'm using the word family for the group of important people around a patient. They might be relatives, they might not be the relatives at all, but the people who are important, they hand over that information, they start to tell the story, they tell it to the next shift that come in, and none of that has been able to happen during COVID. So I think going forward, one of the things that we need to work out how to do is understand the story of the person who is sick and give the components of that story to their beloveds so they can make sense of it. So they've got the jigsaw pieces that Julie and other people who support us in bereavement help us to reassemble.
And it's just come really strongly to me behind me. I've got Picasso's Dove of Peace, and I think if people in the future are going to find peace in what's happened and what's happening, during that time, we've got to understand the complexity that the grief garden path, the grief journey is going to have been created by the experiences. And you've got Fiona Murphy's team up in Greater Manchester, who with the SWAN model, I just hope and pray that model is spread wide, as wide as it possibly can be within the NHS, because to have that contact with your loved one when, as Kathryn says, people haven't been able to have that, and it's going to only be in the next few months, years, that we're going to know how that's affected our grieving, and the grief path that we tread going forward.
We've had a question as well about a different condition. So Claire asked in the chat box about, how do you help somebody who's dying? How do you help to support somebody who's dying of dementia? Because communication can be very difficult sometimes, can't it, around supporting them with the symptoms and things that they might be concerned about. What advice could we give to a family member who's in that support role?
That's a great question, isn't it? So one of the things that we know about dementia is that it's not just a memory problem. It is a generalized brain failure, if you like, and different bits of the brain don't work, but other bits are still working in an unpredictable way. So we know, for example, that people who have been unable to speak for a long time will sing along with songs that are familiar from very long ago. They'll respond to perfumes that remind them of times long ago. People never develop a taste for something they always hated, but they still enjoy things that they always loved. So there are ways of being alongside people without conversation, but we're a very conversation-bound species, aren't we, human beings? So it's about how do we find a way to be present and not have to rely on a conversation that is about now. So one of the things that we do is to help people to find the comforts, the smells, the tastes, the sounds that enable them to feel safe and held. And a person who is demented, who feels really safe, will very often mistake the people around them for their parents, because that was the last time they remember feeling really safe. So let's not say, no, I'm not your mum, silly, it's me. Let's say something like, if your mum was here now, what would she say? What would you like your mum to say to you? Because I can say that to you. So we have to find ways of being alongside people that their brain can work with. And it's very, very hard. It also means that when dementia is first diagnosed, there is an interval where we can start to have those conversations about what matters most, so that future treatment decisions can fit around the things that matter most to that person. But the cruel thing about dementia is that you need to bring those conversations right forward. Whereas you can let somebody potter on with their kidneys not so good or their lungs not so good for quite a lot longer. Because it's the brain, we've got to have the conversations earlier than might feel comfortable. It's an act of courage, but some of you know I'm patron of End of Life Doula UK with Greg Wise, who's an actor and producer, and what Greg says is having those conversations is an act of love.
Yeah.
Julie, a very different question from Lisa in the chat box, and she was asking about the role of educating children in schools about death and dying, and the change that could bring to society if we're more open about that. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it goes wider than that. I think first of all, it would be really nice if teachers were given as part of a fundamental part of their training to understand what it's like for a child to be bereaved. Lucy Hurd, who brought about Jack's Law at the beginning of the year, is just beginning to go into schools, actually. There's been a lot of work done, grassroots work, but she specifically is tackling this. So she would be a really good person to talk to about that. If anybody's interested, do get in touch with Lucy. But my two children were bereaved, and they lost their stepfather, which I just alluded to earlier. They also lost their dad back in 2009, 11 years ago. And the support there. They both moved schools, actually, because the support wasn't particularly there in the beginning. But the school that they went to was very much, they had counsellors, actually as part of the, I know what she was saying about should children learn about death and dying. I think children are a lot more open about it, actually, and I think they are more matter of fact about death and dying. We were talking about guinea pigs earlier, and pets that we lose. In Kathryn's book, there's a lovely piece about I think it's a goldfish, and your children, Kathryn. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, actually, in schools, but to support the teachers to be able to support the children when it does happen, because it does happen. It happens on a daily basis, and the support, it goes back to support. If a child gets the right support on their journey, they land up like my children, absolutely flying. But it's taken them a very long time and a lot of support.
Now, a question to both of you. Jacqueline started a bit of a debate in the chat
Ooh.
box about the word death and dying. And we talk about this a lot in Dying Matters. Do we go straight for those words, or do we use euphemisms? How do we help people? What is the best use of language? What would you say to that? What's your views on that? Kathryn, do you want to start?
I abhor the use of euphemisms amongst professionals and in the media when we are talking generally about dying and death. I absolutely recognize a grieving person's right to use whatever language they need to use to get them through what they're going through. So there's two separate things here. So I'm going to talk about professionals talking to families, and there is no kindness in not making it clear that somebody is so sick that they are likely to die. So I have had so much correspondence since I wrote this book, and if that's any of you, thank you so much. I mean, I'm still getting, I don't know, maybe a dozen messages a week. I've had thousands of messages from people, and there are consistent themes, but one of them is, why didn't anybody tell us? Why didn't anybody say? Why did they let us go home when we were only halfway there, when they had to phone us to say he died and come back? And the staff will think that they told that family, but they didn't use the words. So I think you can say dying, death, dead with enormous compassion.
Yeah.
And it's the compassion that matters and not the words. I think then when we're working with people who are grieving, they will tell us the word that they're using. We know we're talking about somebody who's died. It's not like it's still up for grabs. It's happened. We don't want to bash them over and over again with a word that assaults them every time. But maybe once in each conversation, perhaps at the point when we're saying, I was so sorry to hear that she has died.
Yeah.
We use that word, and then we can just flex with the language that the person is able to bear.
I had a client actually last week who actually used, his wife died 4 years ago, and he actually used the word she died. It's the first time he'd ever said it. First time. And I said, do you realise what you've just said? This is only it was his second session, and I don't see people as, because I'm a coach, I tend to see people on a monthly basis, and you know, it was his second month, and he just suddenly came out with it. And he'd specifically said in the first session, I don't ever say anything other than whatever he'd said. I can't quite remember what he said, and I said, do you realise what you've just said? And he was like, yes, actually. And actually, you know, my clients can contact me anytime. I have a separate messaging service that I use. They can, you know, message me in there, and I'll get back to them when I can. And it's been so freeing for him to actually have acknowledged that she has died and use those words. So yeah, I would concur with you, Kathryn, on that.
I'm struck by the recurring wisdom of societies that are less sophisticated and developed, who almost universally have a period between the death and the family, immediate family, coming back into living a little bit more like usual. They have a transition period. And during that time, families are protected. It's as though there's that it's the mourning time, or it's the grieving time. Obviously, the grieving is going to go on for a lot longer than that. But it seems to me that there's an acknowledgement that there's a period of time during which, and all of us who've been bereaved will recognize this, you don't really know which way is up. You will go to the shops for potatoes and you'll come back without potatoes and with 20 other things that aren't potatoes and still not be able to make the family meal. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's done that.
No.
So there's an interval during which you can't even process to start the processing, isn't there?
No.
And maybe during that period of time, we need to just listen to the words that people are using. And gradually their words will tell us where they've got to.
Yeah, I think I perhaps ought to share, and it might be useful for some people who are watching, and that is, I use the phrase basic watering you, and that is eat, in those stages that you've just been talking about, and it's eat, sleep, breathe, repeat. Yeah. That's it. And because we can even forget to eat, actually, can't we?
Yeah.
We can, we can't sleep. Sometimes we forget to breathe because we're so upset, we're so anxious, and actually, by just those really basic, so it's eat, sleep. If I can hand any wisdom that I've learned, it's eat, sleep, breathe, repeat, and then eventually you can add in a little bit of exercise to that, and then eventually, I've got a lady who's a year on from her husband being ploughed into by a juggernaut, and she's actually beginning just to start doing other things as well. She's actually putting other things into the mix, but actually that's all she could do for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't believe we're practically at 8:30.
We are, aren't we?
Literally, we have 2 minutes left. So I just want to take the opportunity to ask each of you, what do you want to leave everyone with tonight? We've had such a rich conversation. We've talked about so many elements of death, dying and bereavement. Kathryn, do you want to go first? What one thought do you want to leave everybody with as we depart this evening? That
if we all recognise that we're mortal and chat to the people who matter most to us about what the things are that matter the most to us, if they ever in that difficult position of having to advise about decisions in the future, they can speak for you, and that's your gift to yourself, but it's also your gift to them in the future.
Julie?
Oh gosh, I would say when that nanosecond appears where you're on that journey of grief, or you're supporting somebody on that journey, that support is really, really important. Yeah. And to just remember to take really good care of yourself, and that you encourage people to take good care of themselves, and you use those really basic. I think that's got to be my finishing, words. Basic watering of you. Yeah. Just and that goes for all of us here. Particularly in these difficult times. So yeah, just take really good care of yourselves. Well, because you're doing a great job.
On that note, I'd like to say thank you so much to Julie New and to Dr. Kathryn Mannix, and to all of you for listening, for sharing your comments in the chat box, and for helping us take forward this conversation on death, dying and bereavement.